So welcome back, everybody, to another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Jonathan Payne here with us today. Hi, Jonathan. Good to see you. Jonathan will talk about platforms, tokens, DeFi, and smart CBDC. And we're very curious to see what he has to say on these topics. And he will follow not exactly the same order I've outlined here. Before we give the microphone to Jonathan, let me just give a few opening remarks. First, I would like to outline a few technological trends which will impact finance and money. So one is, of course, we have some big networks, platforms, emerging social networks which affect the citizens, and platforms can potentially provide tokens. And on the other hand, we also have supply chains, and supply chains there will be increasingly managed on blockchains as well, so B2B and so forth, Industry 4.0. And the supply chains will have a payment rail and a token with that. And this payment rail can be then programmable. And you can imagine easily whenever there's a little widget going from one factory to another factory, each widget in the future will have a sensor on it, and it will be immediately recorded on the supply chain's blockchain. And then immediately the payment can happen as well. So there will be an explosion of payments because you can immediately make the payments as the widget goes from one factory to another factory. And of course, you can have a lot of contracts, smart contracts automatically executed wherever this widget is or whatever the temperature is or whatever the details are. And there's a lot of automatic execution, and there will be probably a lot of trade credit on these blockchains as well. So what are the big advantages? Of course, we have this distributed ledger technology and other blockchain technologies, but it's not necessarily only the distributed aspects which are advancing. But there's also from other media and other data, we can actually extract huge amounts of data, and the big advancements, how we extract information from data. So we have all this artificial intelligence, deep learning, and much better ways to extract information from big data. And secondly, I think, which is equally important, and Jonathan will allude to this as well, that you can be excluded from these platforms, and that's very costly. So the platform has a power to exclude you, and this way it actually can enforce some repayment of certain loans much more easily than other entities could, for example, banks. And this exclusion power is very important as well. Of course, these trends will play out in different parts of the world differently, and it will also impact what currencies we use, what tokens we use. There might be a fragmentation of monies, so a lot of different forms of monies floating around in terms of tokens, and the different continents, different digital currency areas probably pursuing different strategies. And here's a conjecture what one can potentially see coming, but this is not a normative conjecture, but it's like a conjecture as a positive one. The US, there might be a lot of focus on stable coins. A lot of the stable coins are denominated in US dollars anyway, and they will be easily connected with this programmable tokens, with this particular platforms like supply chains or social media platforms and so forth. And the challenge is how to regulate the stable coins. We have, of course, seen some stable coins collapsing, not being so stable as the name suggests, because there's no backing. Do you make them narrow banks? How do you treat them? And more importantly, how interoperable will these various stable coins be, and how will they be interoperable with some digital form of the dollar in order to avoid fragmentation? Europe, on the other hand, is focusing less on stable coins. It's focusing much more on CBDC, less focused on Industry 4.0. It's much more focused on consumers. Then the question will be, how can you combine a CBDC with other forms of the ledgers which we have out there, and how interoperable are these ledgers? What role will the CBDC play as a legal tender? Will this undermine some lending? And Jonathan will allude to that as well. Then if I go to China, China has a different strategy. Again, it uses more its big platform tech companies, Alipay and WeChat Pay, and also the digital one, to reach out to other countries. And essentially, it's very consumer convenience focused, very much medium of exchange money focused. So it's a different strategy. Again, all of these three strategies actually are expensive in a sense. They can actually reach out to other countries, and the currency areas can extend way beyond the boundaries or the national borders of the country. So of course, emerging economies and developing economies anticipating this, they try to fend off this digital dollarization or whatever you want to call it. They are facing a challenge on their monetary sovereignty, and they're essentially creating alternatives, their own CBDCs, in order to fend off this other digital currencies taking over their monetary policy, and hence they want to keep their ability to conduct further monetary policy. Now, in general, I think there's a huge political economy problem as well. So from the private sector, and here it's focusing on the US, of course, companies would like to create stable coins. In a first step, create a lot of initial coin offerings revenue, senior-rich revenue, and then in a second step, get a regulatory stamp and guarantees from the government. So that's the way you can create a lot of extra money, and this way you can actually become fairly wealthy from the private sector. And you can see some lobbying pressure in this direction. An alternative political economy story, why you introduce CBDCs, of course, is a CBDCs is a way to lean against that, or at least use CBDCs that stablecoins have to be backed 100% with some CBDC. Or the alternative ways also the official sector to push the private sector a little bit to modernize the payment system, use it as a catalyst to improve the payment system, like the European Payment Initiative, to have some counterweight to push for more interoperability, a better execution and faster execution, and also to have some competition with credit cards. So provide on the one hand a public alternative, but with this public alternative, push the private sector, which is often reluctant to give some of the benefits and rents they enjoy from the current system, to really advance ahead. So with this quick overview, let me now move on to the poll questions Jonathan proposed, and then we give Jonathan the floor. So the first question was, what makes money digital? What makes digital money different? Is it the need for a digital ledger, or is it the programmability? And this was actually a question you could answer both A and B, and actually most people said A and B, so that 62% said A and 64% said B, so the majority thinks that both makes digital money special. Second question was about DeFi. Which statements do you agree about the DeFi? So will DeFi, banks will not be needed anymore and they will disappear, or it will be the case banks will not be needed anymore, but they will stay because they have lobbying power and other interests, they will try to stay? Or do you think banks are really essentials, they will not go away and we really need them as well? And the answers were, here you could only pick one answer, 5%, 36%, 58%. So the majority, big majority thinks the banks are essential and DeFi will not eliminate the banks. And if they will be eliminated, they would still stay. That's 36%. Very few people think that banks will disappear. The third question was, will firms be willing to put all the transactions on public ledger platforms? So if you do this supply chain and everything, all the transactions, each widget is moving from one to the next. Should everything is recorded on a blockchain? Will you make this available, this information? Will it be public information or not? And also the payments associated with that. And only 18% said yes, 82% that no, they will not make this available. Finally, what is the most important role of CBDC? And here again, you could answer more than one question. Provide digital cash, because cash is going away, 42% said. Compete with private digital currencies, like stable coins and all these things, 24% said. A catalyst for modernizing banks, as I mentioned, 42%. And integrate digital transactions in a universal ledger. So you have a universal meta ledger where everything is going on. You integrate these payments, that's 45% said this again. And monitor criminal activity, that's the motivation for CBDC, that's only 7%. So most people say, I would say the big categories provide digital cash, catalyst for modernizing banks, and integrate digital payments transactions in a universal ledger. All of them had more than 40% of the answers. With that, I pass on with this insights from you, from the poll, I pass on the mic to Jonathan. He will enlighten us with his perspective on platform, tokens, DeFi, and smart CBDC. Thanks again, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you very much for setting the scene, and thank you to all your listeners for the poll questions. I see some pessimism about DeFi, so let's let's see how it goes as we get questions through the talk. So as advertised, I'm going to talk about tokens, DeFi, platforms, smart CBDC. I think it's fair to say that's a title with a lot of kind of fintech-like jargon. Hopefully, as we sort of go through the talk, this jargon will become a bit clearer and we'll be able to get to the underlying economics of what all this new technology is really about. Okay. So with that in mind, I'm going to try to answer 4 main questions in this presentation. So I want to start by talking about what's really different in the economics of digital money and digital ledgers. Is it, to what extent is it just the same old economics with new labeling? And to what extent is there something really new going on that we need to think about and integrate into our modeling? Then, once we understand a bit what these digital monies are really about, then I want to think about 2 sort of, if you like, the 2 extremes in the different ways you could respond and use this new technology. So one extreme is the so-called DeFi or Decentralized Finance movement, which really wants to eliminate banks and instead build up a sort of new financial infrastructure on a decentralized ledger that is not controlled by any particular intermediary, right? So this is sort of getting rid of intermediation. And then I want to think about the other possible extreme in the way things could go, which is tech firms really moving in and exploiting synergies between having digital ledgers and all the other things that tech firms do. So they can sort of extend credit services and extend market power. So one extreme would be intermediation kind of goes away. The other extreme is we get even bigger intermediaries. So I want to talk about these 2 kind of different ways that this technology could be used. And then finally, we'll talk a bit about how regulators might respond. How would we think about something like open banking legislation in this world where users have the right to control the portability of their own data? How would we think about something like CBDC, and can these things help? I guess, as you know, all this is coming from our recent paper on tokens, platforms, and interoperability. Okay, so let's get into it. So we live in a world with many different varieties of digital monies. We have, digital reserves at the Fed. We have digital dollars in bank accounts and digital wallets like PayPal or Venmo, all these different things. Then we've also seen in the past 10 to 15 years, a whole bunch of sort of fiat cryptocurrencies emerge, like Bitcoin and Ether. And then we've also seen a whole bunch of stable coins emerge, like USDC, Tether, I guess the somewhat ill-fated Terra Luna debacle, but a whole bunch of attempts to have some kind of digital currency that's linked to, that's pegged to the value of the dollar. But is on something like a decentralized ledger. And then, as we'll talk a bit about later in this talk, we've also seen the move of supply chains and other platforms to a token-based system where people using the supply chain end up receiving and holding tokens. Okay, so we've seen a lot of different varieties of these digital monies. What really makes them different to cash? And what really distinguishes these different digital monies? Well, I think to me, sort of, I guess the biggest or starting sort of difference really between all of these digital monies and something like cash is that all these digital monies need a ledger. So if we think about some of the, these really interesting stories we have in economics about why money evolves, we think about like Kocher Lakota's money as memory kind of work. Part of the idea is that money emerges to replace the need for a ledger because it summarizes the net position and we don't have to store information about histories. The complication with all of these digital monies is that we need to somehow keep track of who owns what on some kind of digital ledger. And so all of these digital monies end up being bundled with some kind of ledger technology. And a lot of what makes them different is what these digital ledgers end up looking like. So I've got here a few examples of some of the differences that I think are important or at least relevant for the talk today between these different kinds of digital ledgers. So we can think about who controls the ledger. So if we think about sort of reserves at the Fed, controlled by the Fed, we think about bank accounts where the ledger is really controlled by the bank. Or we can think about sort of crypto, where its big point of distinction is that the ledger is not controlled by a central authority. Instead, the control is decentralized across a whole bunch of different users who end up essentially voting or deciding through a consensus protocol how the ledger should be updated. We can also think about how transparent the ledger is. Is it hidden away and nobody can see it? Or is it something that's upfront that everybody can look at and engage with and do things with? So here we have, if we compare sort of a bank to a crypto or a supply chain blockchain, in the bank, the ledger is there, but you never see it. It's kind of hidden in the background of the bank. One of the big changes that we've seen in some of these new monies is trying to bring these ledgers forward. So everybody can kind of look at them and see them and inspect them. That's certainly the case on the cryptocurrencies. It's also the case on the supply chain blockchains you mentioned in your introduction, and we'll talk more about later in the talk. We can also think about how anonymous payment is, where we sort of live in a current ecosystem where you do your transactions. In some sense, it's anonymous from other people, but it's certainly not anonymous from the bank. The bank sort of knows a lot about what you're doing. I guess we have the crypto that wants to move to full anonymity. And then we also have these sort of supply chain ledgers where we want to move to no anonymity, where we kind of see what everybody's doing, and we use that to organize the supply chain. And then finally, we can think about who can access them. And the big distinction between the government digital money of reserves and all of these other attempts at trying to provide a digital money is that only banks can hold the reserves, whereas all these other attempts at providing money are trying to fill the gap and give private individuals the ability to hold some kind of digital money. Okay. All right.
The financial inclusion thing would be on the public access. That's one of the arguments.
That's one of the arguments with financial inclusion, yes. So but financial inclusion is also about providing lending services. So it's also a question of, who has control of all the information that's on this ledger and how can they use them? Banks use them with some kind of credit score, which means some people get access, some people don't. Going back to your introduction, there's a push in fintech more generally to open up who is able to access all this information and how you would use the information to offer lending. And hopefully the idea would be to offer it to people that previously are not served by the banking sector. Okay, so lots of monies, lots of different ledgers. Okay, so we need these ledgers for digital currencies, and that's introduced a whole lot of design challenges, and I think spurred a lot of innovation in how we think about organizing ledgers. In particular, what we sort of focus on today, or what we're going to discuss, is the emergence of these so-called transparent programmable ledgers. So I'm thinking here of things like Ethereum, Solana, Avalanche, but also these ledgers that get used on supply chain blockchains and more generally. Right? So the key thing about these ledgers is not only do they have token accounts that record your net position, but they also have these things called smart contracts, which is really just a fancy term for the ability for ordinary users to be able to write computer programs that sit on the ledger. So the code sits on the ledger, so everybody can see it. And then when certain conditions happen, these contracts are triggered, and whatever is specified in the code is going to happen. So various transactions might take place. So if we think about you and me, we might both have positions on a ledger. So say I have 10 tokens, you have 15 tokens. That would be in our token accounts. But then the feature of these ledgers is I can write a contract that says if some event happens, then I will automatically, then there will be an automatic transfer of say 5 tokens from my account to your account. Okay. So we have this ability to write contracts to interact with what happens on this ledger. Okay. So we've seen this innovation. And I think one of the things that changes here is how we should think about when you can do contract enforcement. I've called it a different enforcement paradigm. Maybe that's a bit strong, but I think we need to think through what it means to be able to enforce these kind of contracts. So if you want to be able to do that, you really need 2 things. You need access to the flow of information about transactions and other activities, right? So if the information is specifically about what happens on the ledger, so if the contract says Jonathan pays Markus, if Markus makes a transaction in tokens on the ledger, then all the information is already there on the ledger, and that's relatively straightforward. But a lot of the contracts you might want to write, for example, Markus receives a payment of goods. In that case, we want to trigger a contract. For a lot of the contracts we want to write, we need to draw in all kinds of information from the rest of the world, and we somehow need to bring that information onto the ledger. This is what gets called the kind of Oracle problem in digital ledger.
So my widget example would be one of that with the
sensor like your widget example, right? So suppose you have all these widgets being transferred, and based on when the widgets arrive, some kind of transaction happens on the ledger. the ledger needs to have the information about when the widgets are moving. So this gets called this kind of oracle problem, that we need sources of information from outside of the ledger to integrate into these contracts. So one thing we care a lot about is the flow of information. Then obviously we also need to control the payment flow, right? So you can't execute the contracts if we're doing side contracts in physical cash, we can't execute. The payments have to be happening through the ledger to be able to execute these contracts. So I think technologically, we move into a world where you have something much more like sort of segmented enforcement. So if we think about the current legal system, we really have imperfect enforcement in a similar way in a pretty wide range of situations where you have to go through the legal system to try to enforce contracts. With these digital ledgers, we move into a world where if it's happening on the ledger, then we have kind of perfect enforcement and we can write fully contingent contracts. But as soon as we move off the ledger, there's not a lot that can be done. So in this sense, we enter a world where a lot of the economics end up about trying to find ways to incentivize agents to use this ledger so we can move activity into this world where we can do a lot of enforcement. And this is where the ability of the tech platforms to do things helps, because they can generate very strong network effects that make it very attractive to move people into these ledgers. Okay, so we move to this world where we want to try to get information flows through the ledger, and we want to try to get payment flows through the ledger. And we have to think about which institutions in the economy are best placed to incentivize that activity. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to go through a bunch of different ways that we see responses to this new technology. So we're going to start with decentralized finance, then we'll talk about sort of supply chains and programmable ledgers on supply chains, and then we'll talk about these two policy responses, sort of open banking and centralized digital currencies. All right. So let's start with this DeFi. So in short, what DeFi wants to do is they want to rebuild the financial system without intermediaries. And they want to replace these intermediaries by a collection of financial instruments that are built up using these smart contracts on decentralized blockchain ledgers. Okay, so that's a bit of a mouthful. Let's think about what some of the sort of key features of what they have in mind look like. So the big one, as suggested by the name, is they want decentralized control. So if we think about what kind of ledgers they're going to use, DeFi is built off blockchain ledgers that are updated by consensus protocols rather than by any kind of centralized intermediary. Okay, so if you think about Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of these crypto blockchains, it's not some central power that updates it. Instead, all the users of the network have to decide how to update it. That's part of the decentralized part of DeFi. The other part that's decentralized, they put a lot of emphasis on, is decentralized governance. So the voting power for what's going to happen with all these financial instruments, for example, what kind of interest rate would you set on lending on a DeFi system? Voting power to set interest rates and other features of what these financial instruments look like is typically a proportion by tokens. And these tokens are usually allocated, at least in part, to sort of users or creators on the platform. So it could be the transaction tokens, utility tokens, or often what they have are specific governance tokens. And as you hold more governance tokens, you can have more say in how this financial instrument is going to be organized.
So the decentralized control could be done by proof of stake, I guess, and then the governance could be done by different tokens. Doesn't need to be the same stakes.
Doesn't have to be the same token, and yes. So we've seen, so with blockchains in general, we've seen a bunch of challenges in trying to scale up decentralized consensus updating. So we started with, I think many of the listeners have probably heard about sort of Bitcoin, and that there's some proof of work where in order to get the right to update the blockchain, you have to solve a complicated mathematical task. So it's computationally or it's sort of CPU intensive to try to update the blockchain. And that prevents any particular agent from doing a lot of updates and sort of gaining control of the ledger. But a lot of these blockchains, particularly Ethereum, they've tried to move away from something like proof of work because it takes so much energy and it's not very environmentally friendly. They tried to move to alternative arrangements where it's proof of stake, in the sense that agents that hold more of the coins, for example, if you hold more of the Ether tokens on Ethereum, then you have a greater chance or a greater right to be able to update the ledger and verify which transactions are right and do all those things. I think there's an open question here about whether when we move from proof of work to proof of stake, it's really still decentralized. Because if you think about why we trust it, I guess going back to your paper with Joseph, right? So if it's a proof of work blockchain, we trust it because it's hard to update, right? In that sense, it is kind of decentralized. If it's proof of stake, well, there are big players that hold a lot of the tokens that get to update it. And ultimately, we trust them because they have a lot of skin in the game, right? They hold a lot of the wealth in the system, so they don't want to destroy it. But that's actually fairly similar to why we might trust a bank, right? The bank has some franchise value and we don't want them to lose it. So there's an open question about how decentralized these platforms end up sort of really being as we move away from proof of work based tokens. So that's partly a sort of philosophical question about what we call decentralization. But
according to decentralized governance, there are different decisions like setting the interest rates and doing some other regulation. You could have different tokens. You can have interest rate tokens. And
yes, you have a lot of flexibility in how you want to do this governance. I mean, if you like, I mean, in some ways, there is an analog to equity here, right? So these governance tokens look a little bit like tradable equity. When I talk to people in DeFi about, why is this not just like equity? Well, part of it is about the ease of issuance in the tokens, and part of it is the ease of trading. But in principle, from an economic point of view, it does look somewhat similar to having something like a tradable stake in the overall platform that gives you some kind of right to influence the way you update. I think with a lot of these problems, both with the decentralized control and decentralized governance, in some sense, what you're seeing is that the DeFi industry is kind of rediscovering some of the problems of traditional finance, and politics, right? Because we start off with this something that looks like kind of a direct democracy where you have a whole bunch of people that all vote on how to update the ledger. And then over time, they have to work out how to delegate responsibility, how to set up governance structures, how to discipline the governance structures. The same way we sort of move to other voting systems, we move to kind of equity-based corporate governance. And they're kind of wrestling with the same difficulties about how do you get kind of user input into the update of the system in a way they think works better than the current kind of equity shareholder arrangement. Okay, so maybe in the interest of time, we should move on. So the final thing I just want to mention, though, is these systems are built to be very modular, right? So the idea is that you use these smart contracts to create kind of building blocks, these financial primitives, such as, the ability to hold tokens in custody or swap tokens or create new types of tokens. And then these are building blocks for building out all these applications. And so to give an example, I think of how this is meant to work. So I teach the fintech course here, and my students have to do a term project. And half of the groups ended up using the Ethereum programming language to build out decentralized applications. And they were able to take a hold of the building blocks and relatively quickly turn out quite impressive and sophisticated sort of new financial applications. If you like, the attempt here is to finance what happens in the rest of the internet. If you want to set up a website, you can pretty quickly just set up a website. The idea of DeFi is to make finance similar. You want to launch a new financial product? Fine. There's a whole bunch of sort of building blocks out there. You take the code, you quite quickly get up and running your financial product. That's kind of the idea of what we want to have. Okay. So this is part of a bigger movement from sort of Web 2.0 and centralized platforms to this decentralized internet. But we'll leave that for the moment. Listeners can ask more questions if they want about it. Okay. So what's the aim of all this? So this is a pretty ambitious and interesting kind of attempt to rebuild finance. What are they trying to do here? Well, I mean, one thing, obviously, I think the most basic goal here is to decentralize control of financial services and eliminate these what they see as sort of rent-seeking intermediaries and banks. They're also very concerned about privacy and anonymity. So they want a way to do financial transactions where no one can essentially see what you're doing. So some anonymity, well, not see, but you have anonymity in how you do all these transactions. As per the example of kind of my students and quickly building up applications, they really want to decrease these barriers to entry so that you get the kind of innovation in finance that we've seen in many other areas of digital life. This explosion of kind of new ideas and applications and software coming in. They want financial inclusion. In particular, they want to move to a world where users are profit participants, right? So the idea is as you start using these platforms, you get the tokens, the user tokens or the governance tokens or many different types of tokens. And as the platform becomes more attractive, your tokens become worth more, right? So if you've got Ethereum early in Ethereum, but being a user in the system, that Ethereum appreciates, or at least that's the idea. And so you share in the profits, right? So it's a little bit like, that's the sense in which you're being paid a little bit in tradable equity. So you're paid in something that makes you a profit participant in how this whole system is going to be used, is going to work. Increase interoperability and increase transparency.
But if you don't have any rent at all, you don't have any franchise value, that limits you also what you can do, I guess.
What do you mean by what you can do? You mean
if you don't have franchise value, it's the enforcement is probably limited even within this digital space.
Yes, I think that's fair. So we might think that a lot of the reason that we might think that part of the reason banks can offer some of the contracts they do is because they have this franchise value from the rent seeking. I think that's a challenging question for DeFi. I guess this comes to the next slide with sort of, I think, so I mean, I find this DeFi very interesting, exciting. You see all this, you sort of, I mean, for people that think about financial theory, it's kind of very interesting. You see all these, you're rebuilding from scratch. You see all this financial theory kind of being worked out and rediscovered and worked through. But I think there are kind of two challenging questions. And one of them very much relates to what you say, which is this decentralization and disintermediation kind of really, really possible? So we've seen sort of a bunch of recent attempts, for example, the peer-to-peer lending systems that came in not that long ago, which were meant to kind of lead to kind of decentralized finance with individual borrowers, borrowing from sort of individual mom and pop lenders. But what we saw happening was the banks kind of move in and end up kind of using this as more like a retail arm of the banking sector. So we've seen kind of recent attempts at decentralization or disintermediation kind of fail. And this goes very much to your question, right? So I think that the claim from a lot of the people in DeFi is the reason that we have, that disintermediation has not been able to be achieved is really a technological reason. We haven't had the right technology to be able to have something like a decentralized ledger. But as you allude to, there might be a lot of other reasons why, right? So it might be important, it might be that the regulatory barriers to entry, it might be that there's kind of anti-competitive behavior by banks and other financial intermediaries that make it hard to enter. Or as you say, it could be that the rents the banks get, right, are fundamentally important in terms of them being able to provide the services, right? That's another issue. And I think more generally, I mean, for a lot of economists, I think we would probably think there's some kind of economies of scale in intermediation. The bundling a lot of these different services potentially leads to greater efficiency. And part of the reason why DeFi has found it sort of hard to compete on the cost front is because it can't access the same economies of scale. So there's kind of this difficult open question here about what is the reason we have intermediaries in the first place? And is it really just a technological issue? Are there sort of other more fundamental economic reasons why we end up with intermediaries? And I guess the other thing to think about here is how important decentralization really is for these goals, right? So if we think about, decentralized control can be an ends in and of itself, and I think many of the people involved are very, very keen on decentralization. But if we think about many of these goals, it's not clear whether the decentralization part is the most important thing, or whether having kind of this new ledger technology, these flexible programmable ledgers, is more important, right? So if we think about the need for transparency, we can have transparency potentially on a ledger that's centrally updated, similar with interoperability, potentially similar with barriers to entry. So I think it's also an open question how important the actual decentralization part is to all of this, and how important the ability to have kind of user-built programs on the ledger and have this sort of different kind of access to the ledger, how important that is relative to the decentralization. Okay. But overall, in terms of, for economics, right, I think what we see here is we really need to think about the interaction of these digital ledgers with something like industrial organization, right? So this is what, it's understanding this connection that really helps us to answer these kind of difficult questions about what DeFi can do, and more generally about what's going to happen with these sort of digital ledgers being increasingly integrated into the rest of the economy. You want me to pause for questions, Markus, or push on?
No, I think let's push on.
Okay. So let's think.
So also you've dismissed DeFi. Let's see what you're coming up now.
Dismiss DeFi. No, okay.
Or question DeFi.
Okay, so I think.
Sorry, there was a disruption.
All action. I think the DeFi gets everyone excited. I guess that's the message. Okay, so I want to jump to the other extreme, right? So that's the attempt to remove intermediaries. But going back to this IO question, what about if sort of tech firms kind of enter in and we potentially have the sort of bigger intermediaries in this space? Okay, so here I draw in our paper where we attempt to build out something like a model of the interaction between digital ledgers and platform competition, sort of an IO digital ledger model. So we think about a world where there's a supply chain, and in this supply chain, the agents transition from being producers to sellers to buyers. When they're producers, they need to borrow, but they lack collateral and commitment. So it would have to be uncollateralized borrowing to start this supply chain. Once they've produced, they hold inventory and they're a seller looking to sell their goods. And after they've sold, they hold currency and they're a buyer looking to buy. In both cases, they have to search for trading opportunities. So there are matching frictions in this market. And then finally, the buyers, they need currency for these transactions. Okay, so there's a need for a store of value in this world. Cool. So into this, we insert a private platform that offers credit services, matching services, and a digital ledger. Okay. And they do this, and when they do this, they have to compete in 2 dimensions. So they have to compete with an entrant private platform that offers the same services that they do. So it's a contestable markets model. And they also have to compete with a public marketplace that uses public money. So there's competition along the entire kind of platform ledger dimension. And there's also competition with kind of money used in the general marketplace. Okay.
So the public marketplace doesn't have a ledger.
The public marketplace doesn't have a digital ledger. Yes, that's right. Okay. So they're using money anonymously. Okay.
And why do you need both forms of competition?
So we want both forms of competition because ultimately we want to use this model to think about something like the introduction of a CBDC. And when we think about introducing this, we need to understand how it affects competition along the dimension of sort of ledgers, but also in terms of a regular currency. Mm-hmm. Because it's having this overall ledger dimension that generates the synergies in this world. So we need to think about how something like a CBDC coming in would compete with the part that's going to generate these synergies. Okay. So in this world, okay, so the incumbent platform then uses this ledger to organize payments and contracts. And when they do this, they have to design the setup of this ledger. So they have to design interoperability in the sense they have to work out the exchange rate for moving tokens off their ledger. And they have to work out the portability of all the information that sits on their ledgers to other ledgers, right? This is the currency interoperability and the overall ledger information interoperability. Okay. So to reinforce this, I've got a sort of diagram to think through what's happening here. So we have a platform that provides, a ledger that holds tokens, it holds contracts, and then they also provide a matching service in this market for bringing buyers and sellers together. Then there's also a public marketplace that trades with money. Okay. In this world, there are 2 types of agents. There are these debtors who borrow from the platform via contracts on the ledger in order to get the funds to create inventory. And then there are also going to be currency holders who hold potentially tokens and hold potentially money in the public marketplace. So one type of competition here is this competition between the platform and this public marketplace. So when trade takes place, the sellers give the goods to the buyers make payments. So if they use the platform, then they make payments in the tokens offered by the platform on their ledger. If they trade in the public marketplace, then they would have to take their tokens off the ledger, convert them into money and trade in the public marketplace. And the platform can control the exchange rate at which these tokens are taken off, right? So they can penalize or charge a fee when people exit the ledger, take their tokens off the ledger. Okay, so that's one dimension of competition. But then there's also a dimension with a potential entrant ledger, right? That also offers tokens, contracts, and matching. And yes, we also have the token exchangeability. So there's a question of what exchange rate can you move your tokens off one ledger into dollars and back onto the new ledger, right? But then we also have to think about additional features. We have to think about how information that was on the original ledger would potentially get moved over to a new ledger that comes in, right? So we need to think about the portability of all of the contracts that are on this ledger. We need to think about the portability of all the transaction histories that are, from all these transactions that have been done over time and have been recorded on this ledger, okay? So we also have to think about what we call this IOTA, which is this information portability. Okay. So to summarize the results in this model, I think we get two main findings. So the first is that this digital ledger technology does create synergies, right? So in this world, the incumbent platform has information about all the trades, and they have control of the token ledger. So they have the two features that are required to execute these kind of smart contracts on the ledger. Plus, they have the capacity to exclude agents from the platform if they don't use the token ledger. So they also have the ability to really strongly incentivize people to be on the ledger and to participate in this contract enforcement. Okay, so they can incentivize.
So John, can you tell us a little bit? You mentioned earlier this Oracle problem. So when the good moves from one to the next, that's the platform observes that. Right.
So the fundamental synergy here is by bundling the retail platform with the digital ledger, the retail platform has all the information about these trades. So because these two things are combined, we solve the Oracle problem. That's the sort of fundamental synergy that means that it's very helpful to connect the information from retail trade into the information on the digital ledger. So here we have it that there's one organization that bundles all these things together. Of course, you could also imagine that Ethereum signs a contract or something with Amazon and all the information is automatically shared. You could imagine information sharing without a conglomerate, but here we focus on a world where you need this conglomerate in order to get all this information sharing to happen sort of frictionlessly onto the ledger.
Okay. And so essentially, Ethereum can do that or Amazon can do that because they do all three services, but a normal bank could not do it.
Right. So here, the extra information and extra enforcement that comes from being a retail matching platform gives you this extra synergy. That means you can provide more uncollateralized trade credit in the supply chain than would be provided by some other kind of financial intermediary, like a bank. So that's the basic synergy here, that you can provide trade credit in this environment that otherwise would be quite difficult to provide.
Because you see the sales revenue essentially happening and take it away right away.
Because you have all the information and all the control of the retail platform, plus all the information and control on the digital ledger, having both things. Okay, so we have this synergy, but we also see the platform is able to use this ledger or their control of the ledger to increase their market power.
But can I just, sorry, this power to exclude you from the platform, so the capacity to exclude agents, you didn't mention, but it's important as well, no?
So if we go back to, contract enforcement here, right? So contract enforcement in this world, we need the information flow, we need the payment flow, and we need a way of incentivizing agents to provide, well, the information flow is provided by the bundling of the retail platform with the ledger. But we need to incentivize agents to do their payments through this system. And the ability to exclude is one way in which these incentives can be provided. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So we see on the one side a synergy, we can provide more credit, right? On the other hand, we see the potential for the platform to exploit their control of the ledger and increase market power. So what the platform chooses to do is they choose to restrict the movement of tokens by charging exchange rate fees. So they make it costly for token holders to move to the new entrant platform. And they restrict some information portability. So they restrict the portability of transaction histories. So entrants cannot use all of the information from all the history to provide better matching services. But they end up promoting the portability of contract information. So if people do move, contracts can still at least partially be enforced on other platforms. They do all these things, right? So all these things they do it to deter new platform entry. And so by exploiting their control of the ledger to restrict interoperability and deter new platform entry, they're ultimately able to charge higher fees. So in this sense, we see the DeFi fear in this model, that the tech platforms plus the digital ledgers do indeed give this extra market power and higher markups in this world. Okay, so we see the synergy, we see the potential for greater market power. I think a helpful way to think through what's going on in this world is to think in terms of the exposure the agents have to the ledger. So the way I think about this is there are buyers and they are currency holders, and they really have a positive claim on the ledger, right? They have positive token holdings and they have a positive information position in the sense that all their transaction histories are on the ledger, and having those transaction histories really enables better matching, right? So it's like they have like a 5-star rating or reputation or various things that ultimately mean they can use the platform more effectively, right? So they have a positive position in the information on the ledger.
Does it matter that tokens I can pass on to somebody with information, my 5-star rating I cannot pass on? Right. So the fundamental distinction here between these two dimensions is that the tokens can be traded amongst the agents. That's like the regular currency competition. But the information, I can't just trade with other buyers and sellers. But for that, that's relevant for the competition between the ledgers. So that's another reason why we need to have these two dimensions of competition. One dimension refers to tradable tokens and how that ends up being, how competition happens in that dimension. But then to understand how your overall exposure to information ends up feeding through into the platform competition, we have to have competition with another ledger that could potentially use all of the information that's there on the ledger. Okay. All right, so buyers have a positive claim on both tokens and on information. Sellers who hold inventory and loans, they really have a negative claim on the ledger. They have a negative claim both in terms of a negative token position, but they also have a negative information position in the sense that it's the contract information on the ledger that enables enforcement. The information is hurting them and helping the platform. So what the platform really wants to do in this environment is they want to restrict interoperability where agents have a positive claim, and they want to promote interoperability where agents have a negative claim, right? So they want to restrict the movement of tokens and transaction histories because that locks in buyers, right? The buyers have a positive value with the platform and you're making it hard for them to move their tokens and information off. On the other hand, you want to allow the sellers to move all their information with them. The sellers have a negative information claim and you want to make the ledger as portable as possible. So when the sellers move, the negative information claim moves with them, right? So you want to allow interoperability where there are negative claims, and you want to restrict interoperability where there are positive claims. That's kind of the fundamental force acting in the way that the platform thinks through how to design this ledger to maximize their profits. Okay. So with that in mind, we can start to think about two different policy responses, both to kind of the emergence of DeFi, but also to this possibility of kind of these big intermediaries and more market power. So one response is this so-called open banking or open data or open architecture approach. Okay. So if we think about traditional finance, we think about intermediaries that control the portability of information, like the example we just went through, right? So intermediary decides, is information portable or not? Or in this case, the platform ledger owner decides the portability. Open banking does a lot of things, but for the purposes of this talk, the thing we want to emphasize is it wants to give users control about what happens to their information. So they want to give users control on how this information can be used. And here we focus on how this information is ported around. So in our model, the buyers would control the portability of their information, which is all these transaction histories. And the sellers would control the portability of the information that relates to them, these loan contracts.
We've seen open banking introduced in a few different places, like the UK. So it's sort of important to think through what these implications are.
But now you focus only on portability of information. The token, positive or negative, you have switched off, mentally at least.
I think that's not the key thing for understanding this open banking.
Right.
So we focus in on this information portability to think about what what this open banking is really about. So if we focus in this way and we kind of compare what platform control looks like to open banking, well, as we talked about, the platform wants to stop the transaction being moved. So new entrants can't provide similar service to they do, but they want maximum portability of information. With open banking, you would get the inverse relationship, right? So the buyers are the ones that have the positive information exposure. So they want to port all their information, right? They've got a great reputation on the old platform. The platform's using that to provide really good services to them. They want all that to move across to any new entrant that comes in, right? So they want to port all the information. Sellers have the negative information exposure. They do not want the loan contracts to move with them. They would like to leave the loan contracts behind so they're able to default. So you have this completely kind of inverse relationship in how the agents versus the platform would want to move the information. And we see when the platform controls it, they end up with a positive value. But when the agents control it, we end up with a negative value in the sense that the incumbent would not want to set up this loan market, this uncollateralized loan market in this world where the agents themselves are controlling how the information would move. So it's a little bit beyond the scope of the exact model, but I think we can see some similarities with this platform control and what we see in the current banking system. So this is saying you want to hide all your transaction histories, but you want to share information about contract default, which I think is a lot of what banks do, right? Banks they have credit registries where you share information about who defaults, and we have universal credit ratings, right? That's very much the IC, right? Sharing information about loan contracts and default and all that information. On the other hand, banks want to hide all their information about transaction histories and everything that helps them provide good services. They want to hide all that information, but they want to share all the information about default and loans, right? And that's very much.
But would you go so far that open banking only means we hurt credit registries because the person who defaults will say, no, I don't want to have it on the credit registry?
Yeah,
that's
so here it would be like the open banking is you're choosing whether or not your information about your debts ends up feeding into a credit registry, right? That's what this IC is equal to 0. You would be blocking your information from entering in these kind of credit registries if you took this to the extreme. And that's what and that's what hurts the platforms in the sense that in that sense you're less able to track defaults across this whole system. So this is in a sense in which in this model, this uncollateralized credit, which was this positive synergy, is quite fragile, right? So we needed this uncollateralized credit to initiate the supply chain, but providing the credit always makes the incumbent platform vulnerable because a new platform can enter and offer the agents the opportunity to move and default on all their loans, right? And so the incumbent is only going to set up this uncollateralized credit if they can get compensation, right? They need to be able to either force portability of the contract information, or they need to be able, or they need to be able to restrict the movement of tokens and transaction history. So there's some other way of trying to get compensation for this ability of the creditors or the people with a negative information position to abandon them. So I think this should give us some pause for concern about trying to regulate something like total interoperability across all these tech financial platforms. We want to be careful that we don't take away the potential synergies by forcing more interoperability than is.
But here you assume there's perfect information sharing, or there's open banking, and there's no exchange rate fee when you swap your tokens for the dollars. Is this correct?
Well, we could add in an extra point here. So you could also think that you could have open banking and perfect sharing of information if there was some other way for these platforms to earn the fees. So for example, if they could charge exchange rate fees to lock people in, that would offset this potential for potential to make losses on the loans, right? So cross-subsidization between using restricting token portability to gain market power can compensate for setting up this loan network. You can think of this uncollateralized credit as a little bit like a public good here, and you have to give them some kind of incentive to set this up, because once it's set up, people can hurt you because it's being set up.
But when you write total interoperability, you mean interoperability in terms of information, but also in terms of swapping tokens into dollars or
Yeah,
tokens.
I mean, if we say we
we
have these platforms, they have tokens, they have information, we enforce, the government says everything has to be completely interoperable. You cannot charge any fees, you cannot lock in any information, you cannot do any of these things. In this world, this would shut down the uncollateralized credit. This would start to take away this image. Okay, so I just want to quickly finish off with the other, another much discussed public policy response, which is this CBDC. So we can consider two different types of CBDC here. So we could have a legal tender CBDC on a kind of disconnected, non-programmable ledger. And this kind of CBDC kind of shuts down synergies. This starts to cancel synergies. Because without the CBDC, the platform forces sellers to only accept tokens on their platform so they can force payments through the ledger, right? That's how they enforce the contracts. But once you introduce a legal tender CBDC, they can no longer force the agents to use their tokens. And so now the agents can start to organize side payments in this CBDC that enables them to circumvent these smart contracts. So the CBDC dollarizes these private platforms and forces the platforms to potentially intermediate payments or abandon these kind of uncollateralized loans, right? So a simple legal tender CBDC with a non-programmable ledger that's disconnected, that starts to really hurt these synergies. On the other hand, we can think about the other extreme.
But can you be not connected? I mean, there's the Ethereum platform and my CBDC is not connected part of the Ethereum platform.
Yeah, I mean, there's some CBDC, it sits on a ledger at the central bank, but it's not something we all see. It's not something I can write programs on. It's not something I can execute smart contracts on. That's what I mean by it being disconnected. And so you can always sort of go through the CBDC and avoid any kind of contracts that have been set up in the rest of the system.
And because it's legal tender, buyers can always pay, or the sellers can always demand essentially being paid in dollars CBDCs.
Right. So giving a setup where the platform is, so it's important for the synergy we talked about for the platform to be able to force the sellers to use their token, right? You don't want to give them some option where you have some other currency with that they can always say, they can always come to the platform and say, well, I just want to use this other currency. And there's no way to integrate that currency with any of the contracting. And so they always have this side trade option. So they can use this side trade in default. This makes it very hard to kind of set up something like an automated contracting system.
Just to make sure that it comes across that a token is always a stable coin. There's no additional seigniorage the platform gets from, inflating away the value of the token. The only thing is it can lock you in on saying you cannot, when you want to swap it into dollars, then you have to pay a fee.
I mean, yes. I mean, I guess it depends whether you think of, so if you issue a token,
the initial issuance.
So someone comes to you with $1,
yes.
And they swap it for a token 1-for-1, but you're only backing it by epsilon. Yeah. So the signage revenue you get each time is 1 minus epsilon, right? So it's like somebody comes to the platform and says, I'm going to give you $1 for a token. And the platform says, great. If you come back and you convert the token back into dollars, you only get epsilon. So 1 minus epsilon is kind of the signage benefit you get. So in some sense, the lower epsilon is, the closer it kind of looks to a fiat currency, where someone is giving you money for something that you're not promising any kind of convertibility for. So the epsilon is governing the degree of convertibility. Yes, in this model, we assume they can commit to whatever convertibility they promise, and there's nothing like a kind of run problem. So these are kind of fully backed up to epsilon. So you promise a certain backing, and then that backing is committed to. But you can choose how much backing they have. That's kind of the epsilon. Okay.
But so you mean the platform chooses?
Yeah, the platform chooses. Yes, yes.
Or the regulator enforces.
Or the regulator.
Epsilon 1.
So we could have something like a legal tender CBDC. And this makes it really hard to set up this whole system with automated payment. We could also imagine an alternative kind of world where we have something like a so-called smart CBDC. So we can consider legal tender bundled with a programmable ledger that can integrate with any other contracts that are written or enables contracts to be written on it, so that you could put this legal tender CBDC directly into something like a digital ledger supply chain, right? So it could be integrated straight in. In this case, we could think about the platform using this CBDC ledger to write and enforce contracts, so long as the CBDC becomes the dominant currency, and so long as all the other platforms and marketplaces provide information into this CBDC ledger, right? So I think the open question here with something like an introduction of a CBDC programmable ledger is, what does it take to get all these different participants to start sharing information onto this kind of universal CBDC ledger, right? So conditional on the other platform sharing, a platform has a much larger benefit from sharing information. Because if I put all my contracts onto this ledger and everybody else is putting their information, we can now enforce contracts much more broadly, not just when people trade on my platform, but when they trade on other platforms, the public marketplace. We have something much closer to kind of a universal enforcement system. But it is all conditional on other platforms agreeing to put all the information on. And so there's potential coordination problems and potential issues about to what extent platforms prefer to intermediate payments. And so really we end up with this interesting but tricky question about how would you actually incentive? And this is going back to the poll question you asked at the start. How would you actually incentivize all these platforms to start sharing a lot of this information through something like a universal ledger? Because
Can we make this very
fundamental trade-off here between privacy and enforceability, right? You want to share a lot of information onto this universal ledger so you can do a lot of contract enforcement, but that means people have to be happy with having a very transparent world. And that brings partially problems about not being able to protect your ability to use your own information for your advantage, but also privacy concerns that are a bit beyond the scope of this paper. Yes, Markus.
Can you make it very concrete? Let's suppose there is a supply chain. The automotive industry has certain supply chain on a blockchain, and it has a payment rail. The payment rail has to then be integrated with the central bank's CBDC ledger.
Exactly. So there's like a supply chain in the consumer goods market for like refrigerators, and there's a supply chain for cars, and these things kind of intersect at some point. And then there's a CBDC ledger, and you would need to have the contracts are able to be enforced kind of via the CBDC ledger, irrespective of whether they're kind of written in the auto goods supply chain, or they're written in the refrigerator supply chain or anything else. So it's all about to what extent could you coordinate all of these different industries to start providing information through a common ledger. That's really what would be required to get kind of the economies of scale. So you could look at this and say this is a little bit like a chicken model of the government or straw man model of the government, in the sense that, well, we just, if everybody can coordinate, we can have a really great enforcement system. And if not, we can't. I guess the way to think about a richer question than just, suppose the government can magically get everybody to enforce, is to try to think through what would it take to get all of these different players in the market to start providing information through a kind of common ledger. That's the incentive compatibility constraint you would need in this government design problem.
But is there any smart technology like a zero knowledge, something where you can still protect privacy and nevertheless have everything on a common ledger? Integrated interoperable ledger design.
Privacy from whom? I mean, I guess as you know, there've been a bunch of proposals for how you could do something like a CBDC with privacy, and trying to use the technology to think that through. I think it's a bit early to say to what extent there is a privacy enforceability trade-off, right? So a lot of what's being thought about is not how would you have privacy but manage to enforce uncollateralized credit across something like a more integrated and universal ledger. It's something more like, if I want to make payments, how do I work out who knows what, and how do I kind of break up the information and these kind of things. So I think at the moment it's not entirely clear we have the answer to that question. I don't know if we know where the limit is on what this sort of trade-off looks like. Okay, so I think that the overall lesson I think I want to emphasize about CBDC is, in analogous work to sort of like what Monica and Martin write about, or Todd Keister, the thing we want to think about is, does the introduction of CBDC break down synergies that exist in the private marketplace between offering something like a digital ledger or a payment system and offering other services? I think the contribution here is to think through a different kind of synergy. So it's not a synergy with providing, say, credit lines and deposits or special lending opportunities of the banking sector. This is a case where the synergy is really about the ability to bring together the information and control from the retail platform with the control of a digital ledger. Bring those things together and provide credit that you wouldn't otherwise be able to provide. And what I think this paper would teach us about CBDC is we need to think hard about whether or not CBDC sort of enhances these synergies or eliminates these synergies. And I think a lot of that is about whether or not you could continue to do something like smart contract enforcement through a CBDC ledger world or not. I think that's kind of the key issue for trying to resolve that particular question, at least for this particular synergy. Of course, there are many other issues about CBDC. You know, do you want to be able to put pressure on the banking sector to do things? You know, are you worried about sort of traditional banking synergies? There's a bunch of other reasons you might be interested in this, but for this paper, we focus on this synergy.
But if I summarize it, it's all about the design of the CBDC. It's not about CBDC yes or no. It's like how to smartly design it in order to not.
I think that's a good way to put it. So I think in this world, introducing CBDC is not good or bad. It's really about the design of the ledger, which goes back to the initial point. I think what really distinguishes these digital monies is the different ledger design. And CBDC is the same. You could have CBDC with very different kinds of ledger design, and the impact on competition and welfare will look radically different. So I think in some sense, we have to move away a little bit from thinking about sort of money as an amorphous thing and start to think about money bundled with a ledger. And then you have to think about how this ledger is designed and how this design of the ledger then integrates with other things that are going on in the economy. Otherwise, it's very difficult to think about what benefits or costs, you know, CBDC might impose on the economy. Does that make sense?
Yes. Essentially, okay, I'll let you conclude.
I was just going to say, you know, I had 4 questions. I think we're well placed to go back to those 4 questions. So what's different about digital money and ledgers? I feel it's very much this need for a, you know, what's different about digital monies is this need for a digital ledger. And this has led to a whole lot of innovation. We've seen much more sophisticated ledgers come in that allow for different kinds of contracting arrangements. Second question, can financial services move from banks to decentralized finance? Well, I think it's unclear that the new technology really overcomes all the forces that were generating intermediation in the first place. I think on that front, the jury's a bit out, is still out, although sort of a lot of technological advance has gone into trying to understand how you could do something like decentralized finance. Third question, can tech firms exploit synergies and extend credit services? Well, yes. So we see new synergies emerging, but we also see they can use their ledger control to really increase market power, right? So we see the pro and the con here. So yes, they would want to do it, but they'd only want to do it to the extent they can use it to kind of increase their control of the whole system and get bigger rents. And then how should a regulator respond? Well, I think the overall guiding principle for response here is they want to try to preserve the synergies that come from integrating digital ledgers with, you know, retail platform operations. And there are ways you could do that where you enhance the synergies, like we talked about the smart CBDC, or you could start to hurt them, and that will give you very different kinds of responses. That's my short, sharp attempt to respond to the initial 4 questions that we opened with.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Let me just, so you made a big point and a big push saying, you know, we live in an existing legal structure, and the existing legal structure is much broader, but it is less precise as in the digital world where we can enforce things much more cleanly, but we have this oracle problem. Now, if you look across countries, let's suppose you have certain countries where the legal structure is not so well developed, or the court system is not working so well. Do you see that the DeFi, or, you know, doing some non-DeFi, some, you know, platform digital ledgers connections and interoperability across that, do you see there's a big opportunity for these countries and they're moving faster in that space because the need is higher? Or how would you, is it a big opportunity for developing countries to overcome some of the legal shortcomings they might face?
So I think the DeFi industry certainly sees that as a big advantage. So, you know, they often talk about the need for to escape kind of financial repression. You're in societies where the legal system is corrupt, or there's some kind of authoritarian response, and you need to be able to do transactions or write contracts outside of that. And yes, they also talk a lot about cross-border contracts where you don't have the regular legal system and the ability to try to use DeFi to do that. So, I mean, I think the potential's there. I think the difficulty is the level, at least currently, the level of technical sophistication required to participate. So part of the issue is that, DeFi is a little bit like the Wild West at the moment. I mean, sort of by construction in a way, because, it is trying to operate in some sense outside the traditional rules of the financial system. It's also something where you have to be, it's not the most user-friendly interface, right? Or the parts that are user-friendly, you have to worry about to what extent in the back end, there's something that might hurt you, right? Because there's not a lot of guarantee if you don't understand the back end of the system that there's not something that can bite you later on. So at the moment, I think it's a system that requires sort of a high level of knowledge and a high level of kind of skill to engage with. I think there's an open question about to what extent that mitigates the current ability of the system to kind of service areas where there's kind of much lower, areas that have maybe less economic development or less sophisticated, financial and technical systems to begin with, right? So I think the sort of barriers to use it at the moment might partly offset the potential to overcome these kind of issues. But if interfaces can come in and it's clearer how to trust the back end of kind of regular applications on it, then I guess, I think the potential is there in the longer term.
So I have two more questions. One, just following up from the questions in the audience. Could you explain how this DeFi would help for mortgages, for example? Because at the end, ultimately, you still have to seize or foreclose a house. So you still need a regular legal system to implement that. You wouldn't dispute that, I guess.
No, I don't dispute that. I mean, I think this is that is definitely an open question. So, I mean, there have been attempts. So I guess I did a webinar with Asif Hajani, who runs Figure, which is quite focused on trying to do mortgage lending. And so in that world, they put all the features of the mortgages onto a blockchain, and then they use that to kind of find a way to trade mortgages and do things and package mortgages. Yes, but definitely enforcement of physical objects to some extent, much of it happens in the real world. And that's definitely, a barrier in the sense that it's hard, if you're operating in a much more digital space, it's much easier to see how you could do enforcement purely in kind of like a DeFi ecosystem. Once you move away from that, you have to think about how you're going to integrate with other aspects of it. I mean, you talk about the supply chain example, which is a good example in the sense that what they do on the supply chains is they put tokens that track the movement of all the different goods. And so you work with a system where you withhold payment until certain things are done, and you can work out when things are done by tracking the movement of where everything goes. And so in that sense, you try to integrate the enforcement of the payment contracts with the payments. But if it's something like a mortgage on a house, you've bought a house, you have to kick the person out. It's very hard to point to a digital ledger and say, well, I own it. Possession is, in that case, possession is going to be 9/10 of the law, and that's going to be hard to shift. So I think there are some things that are particularly difficult to move into a DeFi-like structure. If you listen to a lot of these podcasts, you see a lot of them kind of, or listen to you see them grappling with how to think through these kind of examples, because you go from digital objects that are very easy, something like a supply chain, which is more easy, which is a bit more difficult, maybe still feasible, to things that are extremely difficult to try to integrate into this world.
So let's conclude with the final question. You said you look at the two polar cases. One is DeFi, everything is decentralized, there's no concentration of power. On the other hand, everything moves much more to these platform structures with a ledger attached to the platform, and actually a universal ledger, ideally, combining everything. If you had to bet on one of the two outcomes, let's suppose you can only go for one of the two extreme outcomes, which way would you think the future will look like in 5 years or 10 years?
I'm not really a betting person, but I think
Or give us percentages. You don't have
give
to
us
say.
percentages. That's even harder, right? You're running a order book with all the people that go on your webinar, right? You have a whole series of bets out over time. We can put the betting on a decentralized system, Markus, and you can be the oracle that feeds in all these bets.
But what's your leaning?
I think for me, I mean, I think it's pretty early with the DeFi system. I mean, it's not so early with crypto. I mean, Bitcoin's been around for a while, but with DeFi is a very recent addition. We're talking about a couple of years it's really taken off. I think it's, so in many senses, it's pretty early to try to make that judgment, but I think for me, I can see a lot of reasons why having transparent programmable ledgers are helpful, right?
Yes.
I think that the barriers to entry in finance are very high. Like it was extremely exciting seeing my students in the course of a semester go to being able to build quite interesting and sophisticated financial applications. That's a really exciting technology. And it would be really exciting to see, innovation and entry into finance in the way we've seen in so many other fields, right? I think so I can see a lot of excitement for that. The decentralization itself, though, to me seems like a harder sell in the sense that if it's really proof of work, so you don't have to trust large players or you don't have like big owners having a bigger stake, I think the environmental costs to me seem very high. And so I think that seems prohibitive. If we move to a world where like big players with big stakes control the system, that doesn't seem as different to something like a traditional banking model where you trust the bank because they have a stake in the game. So in that sense, I think to me the decentralization aspect of it seems less exciting as compared to what you can do with this ledger technology. So in that sense, I guess it seems like if the ledger technology is more exciting than maybe the decentralization itself, then that would lend us to think that firms coming in and offering kind of easy to use ledgers that you can, that are controlled by some kind of central authority like a bank or a platform, but people can kind of work with and integrate and write code on, that seems like potentially like a pretty attractive thing to see.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. So let me just say, so ideally, the regulator should come in and also make sure that there's enough interoperability. But as we have learned, interoperability is not a single thing. It is many dimensions, whether the token is interoperable or the information is portable and all these things. And it's quite subtle. And perfect interoperability is not the ideal thing because it kills off ex-ante credit. So it's quite a subtle thing. So regulators have to be involved and stay on top of the game as well. And of course, the private sector has to push ahead and innovate in that space. And we will see in the next years or decades how the financial system will look like, our money will look like. But it gave us a glimpse today. Thanks again. And I see you around and talk to you
of course,
quite frequently all the time. So, and thanks. And thank to all the listeners for hanging out and being with us and learning with us. And any feedback is welcome. Hope to see you next week again. Next week, we'll talk about American immigrants and why they're so successful with Leah Bustan. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you, Markus. Thank you everyone for listening and giving questions.